in development of male gametophyte, okay, it start with pollen. So this pollen developed from the microspore contained in the sporangia of the anther. Okay, so this is the anther, okay, which contain microsporangium for singular and microsporangia for plural. Alright, so in one microsporangium, there are many microsporocytes. Okay, so this microsporocyte will undergo a process of meiosis, and then they form four haploid microspore. Okay, and these microspore, each of them will undergo the process of mitosis, and they form two types of cell. Okay, generative cell and tube cell. Okay, this generative cell later will form two sperms. Meanwhile, the tube cell later will form the pollen tube. Alright, so the description at the left side, you can read later. Okay, so these are the details on the development of male gametophyte, or the development of the pollen grain. Within the sporangia, or also called pollen sac, of the anther are microsporocyte. Each of them will undergo process of meiosis to produce four haploid microspore. Each of these microspore will give rise to a haploid male gametophyte. The microspore is now known as pollen grain, which is immature male gametophyte. This two-cell structure is encased in a thick, ornate, distinctive, and resistant wall. So these are the characteristics of the pollen sac. Okay, a microspore divides once by mitosis and produces generative cell and the tube cell. The generative cell later will form two sperm, and the tube cell later will develop to form the pollen tube. So this pollen tube is a function to deliver the sperm to the egg. Okay, for the next statement on the microspore is now known as a pollen grain. Okay, so these are the repetitive phrase, so you may ignore this statement, right? Okay, we continue in the development of female gametophyte, okay, or the embryo sac, which develop from the megaspore within the ovules. So this megaspore contained in the ovules is a large diploid cell called the megasporocyte, or also called as megaspore mother cell. The megasporocyte divide by process of meiosis to give rise to four haploid cells. Okay, but only one of them will survive. After that, they will undergo mitosis division 3 times in order to produce an embryo sac. Okay, so this is the process. Okay, roughly the process. From one mother cell, they will undergo meiosis, produce four haploid megaspore. Only one will survive. So this one survivor will undergo 3 times of mitosis in order to perform an embryo sac with 8 nuclear cells. Okay, 3 form antipodal cells, 2 will form polar nuclei, and the egg here with 2 synergid cells flank the egg. Okay, so this is the embryo sac, consists of 8 nuclear cells, okay, haploid cells. So these are the full summary of the process. Within the ovules, megasporangium is a large diploid. So remember, the megasporangium, same goes with the microsporangium in male gametophyte. Okay, they are diploid cell. Okay, later they will undergo the meiosis and then they form haploid cell. Okay, the megasporangium, or for plural we call megasporangia, is a sporangium. Sporangium is like a sac. Okay, one sac that consists spores inside them. Okay, so they produce megaspore that give rise to the female gametophyte or the embryo sac. This megasporocyte will divide by meiosis and produce 4 haploid megaspore. only one of the megaspore will survive and the other three will degenerate or diminish. Okay, the surviving megaspore in the ovule develop into embryo sac. Okay, embryo sac is the female gametophyte. The megaspore will undergo 3 times of mitosis to produce 8 haploid nuclei, which enclose within 7-cell embryo sac. Later we will see the image of the embryo sac. So these 8 cells, they are forming one located near the opening of the embryo sac, we call the egg cell. 2 will form the polar nuclei. Another 2 will form synergid cell which flank the egg. And the 3 nuclei will reside in cell called the antipodal cell, okay, which located at the end of the sac, which is opposite the egg cell. Okay, following pollination, a process called double fertilization. Okay, why it is called double fertilization? Because one sperm of cell nucleus will fuse with the egg cell to form zygote, and the other sperm cell nucleus will fuse with the 2 polar nuclei to form the triploid endosperm nucleus. If you still remember, okay, in male gametophyte, when they produce pollen grain, this pollen grain will mitosis, okay, will do mitosis and they form a tube cell and generative cell. Okay, so this tube cell later they will form the pollen tube. Okay, please revise this. And this generative cell later will form 2 sperm. Okay, 2 sperm cell. So when the this is a stigma. Okay, stigma in the female part. Okay, when this pollen grain they stick to the stigma, they attach to the stigma. Okay, and then the pollen tube start to produce, start to rise, and the 2 sperm will go into the embryo sac. Okay, 1 sperm will fuse with the egg cell, form zygote. Form zygote, which is diploid, and the other sperm will fuse with the polar nuclei to form the endosperm. Okay, so that is why this process called double fertilization, because the sperm fertilize 2 times. Okay, so this is the image of how the process goes. This is for male gametophyte and this is for female gametophyte. Later they will fertilize. Okay, so the fertilization happen inside the embryo sac. Okay, so you may read this description on the formation of pollen grain and the embryo sac. Okay, this is another image. Okay, the diagram that explains the whole process. Okay, now we go into the comparison of asexual and sexual reproduction. Okay, what you have to remember, the point here, number of organisms involved, the involvement of sex cells, the cell division, the genetic variation, and the number of offspring or progeny. Okay, so these are the example of asexual reproduction by vegetative propagation. And for sexual reproduction, as we learned previously, it happened in animals as well and also in plants. In pollination, there are 2 types. Self-pollination, which occur within the same flower, okay, same flower, but different flower on the same plant. Okay, so either it occur inside the same flower because that flower contain both the stamen and the carpel, or between the different flower buds still in the same plant. And we have the second is cross-pollination, which occur between different individual parts of the same species. So what is pollinator? Pollinator is an organism that carry the pollen grain from the stamen to the stigma. They can be insects like bees, birds, bats, or occasionally other animals. Okay, the majority of pollinators are biotic agent. Biotic agent means they are living components. Okay, they are living, such as the insect, okay, bat, birds, and other animals. Bees are the most frequent and characteristic pollinators of flowers. The insects are often attracted to the odors of the flower. For example, bird-pollinated flowers are odorless and red, with the nectar not readily accessed by insects. So these are the character of the flowers that normally bird are used to, okay, used to pollinate. The other plant species are pollinated by abiotic agents such as the wind and water. So wind and water are another type of pollinator which is not living. Okay, now we go into the characteristic of insect pollinated flowers. What are the characteristics on plants that usually loved by this kind of insect? Okay, this insect probably attracted to the plants due to some reason. Okay, the first one is flowers. Usually the flowers they attracted to are large, brightly colored, okay, because brightly colored is more attractive, and scented. Okay, they have some good odors, okay, to attract those insects. If the flowers are small, they may be grouped together to form conspicuous inflorescence. Okay, nectar is often present to attract insect. The pollen itself is fairly abundant. Okay, pollen grains are largely sticky and heavy, usually with rough surfaces, so that they can readily cling onto the insect body. So these are the character of the pollen itself. And the stamen. Okay, what about the stamen? The stamen may not be pendulous. Okay, so look up what is the pendulous mean. Okay, so that is the character for stamen. Now we go for stigma. Stigma are usually not feathery and do not protrude. They are sticky, so that the pollen grains settling on them are not easily displaced. Okay, once the pollen attached, they will remain at that place. And the nectar guides may be seen on the petals. So these are some of the characteristics of plant which cause the insect to be attracted to it. Okay, so these are the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers. Okay, the flowers are usually small, dark colored, and scentless, and thus not attractive to insects. So since this kind of plant, they have abiotic agents as their pollinator, they do not need to be attractive. Okay, nectar is usually absent. The pollen is abundant as wastage is higher, because when the wind carry this pollen, the tendency of losing this pollen are very high. So the pollen must be in enormous number. Okay, many. Pollen grains are small, must be dry, smooth and light, so that they are buoyant and easily to be blown by the wind or air. Okay, the stamen usually have long, slender filament that sway in the slightest wind, and pollen grains are hence shaken out from the anthers, so that this character will help in the pollination process. Okay, and the stigma protrude. Protrude means we can see the structure from external. Okay, protrude, exposed, and are large and feathery, so that they provide a large surface area to catch pollen floating in the air. And the nectar guides are absent. Okay, mechanism that prevents self-fertilization. Many angiosperm, they have some mechanism that make it difficult or impossible for flower to fertilize itself. Okay, for example, in this one flower, okay, even though it has complete stamen and also the carpel, this flower, they do not want to do self-fertilization. Okay, so they have some mechanism to prevent this self-fertilization to be happen. Okay, let's see for Oxalis alpina. Okay, this plant, in order to inhibit self-fertilization, they produce two types of flowers on different individuals. The first type is trump, which is short still with long stamen. Okay, so the still is short but the stamen is long. And the pin type of flower, which is long still. Okay, the still is long but the stamen is short. Okay, so they produce two types of flowers in order to inhibit self-fertilization. So when insect hunt for nectar, okay, the pollen get collected on its body. So the trump pollen, of course, because the trump pollen, the stamen, okay, the pollen is at the upper side. so it is easy for the insect to attach. So this pollen is carried by the insect go to the pin flower. Okay, in pin flower the stigma is at the upper part, so it is easy for the pollen to be attached to the stigma. Alright, so this is one mechanism that is used by plant. The second is for Sagittaria latifolia. So this kind of plant, they have two types of flowers, the staminate flowers and the carpellate flowers. Okay, so this plant is dioecious. In one plant, they only have one gametophyte, either male or female gametophyte. Okay, the most common anti-selfing mechanism in flowering plant we call as self-incompatibility, meaning they do not want to do self-fertilization. Okay, self-incompatibility is the ability of a plant to reject its pollen. So the researchers are unravel the molecular mechanism that are involved in self-incompatibility. So there are the molecular reason why plant can do self-fertilization. Okay, besides the insect, besides the characters of the flowers that they produce, there are molecular reason behind this. Okay, the first, there is 3 plant here. In Brassica species, we have 2 species, the Brassica rapa and the Brassica oleracea. Okay, if you can see, the short for SI is self-incompatibility, meaning this SI, okay, they do not want to do self-fertilization because it is came from the one plant. Okay, the pollen and the stigma from one plant, so they both of them are self-incompatibility. For C compatibility. Why? Because the pollen is from one plant and then they attach to the stigma on the other plant, so compatible. For ISI is interspecific incompatibility. Okay, interspecific meaning interspecies, between different species. So this is Brassica rapa. Okay, and then this is the Brassica oleracea. So there are 2 different species and the process still incompatibility. They cannot fertilize. Okay, some plants, they reject pollen that has S gene. So S gene is the genetic material that contained inside the pollen. So this plant, they can detect the presence of S gene which is not matched to the stigma cell. So this is the stigma. Alright, so on the stigma there is a detector, okay, molecular detector that can detect this S gene. If the S gene is present on that particular pollen, so the stigma will reject that pollen. Okay, if you can see here, we have 3 plants, okay, with pollen S1 and S2. Okay, all the plant is S1 and S2. Okay, now we go into the pollen type. We have S1, S2 here. Alright, so both of them are incompatibility, okay, rejected. And for S1, also rejected, okay, but for S3, accepted. Okay, S3 and S4 here, both are accepted since they came from different plant. Okay, the second is recognition of self-pollen. Okay, if you still remember, once the pollen attached to the stigma, it will start to generate the pollen tube. Okay, so when the pollen came from the same plant, what the plant do is a signal is sent by the stigma. Okay, signal transduction, okay, is sent by the stigma and cause a block in the growth of pollen tube. So if the pollen came from the same plant, there is no growth of pollen tube. When there is no growth of pollen tube, the sperm from the pollen cannot enter into the embryo sac. So these are the mechanism by the plant to inhibit self fertilization. The first one, due to the structure of the flowers, the trunks and the pin. The second is the dioecious type. Either the plant have only one type of gametophyte. And the third part is in terms of molecular. Okay, the presence of S gene and also the block in the growth of the pollen tube. Okay, so these are other terms that you should remember. Dichogamy, meaning the stamen and carpels mature at different times so that they still cannot self-fertilize. Okay, and dioecious plant, meaning the male and female flowers are on different plants.